Thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee on the government's obligations to victims of crime. It's good to be doing this after finally the federal government has appointed a qualified and energetic federal ombudsman for victims of crime. But this appointment is a long way from enough to meet obligations to victims of crime at standards equivalent to what has existed for some time in other comparable democracies. I've set these out in my book, and I will leave one copy of it. The book is Rights for Victims of Crime, Rebalancing Justice. The book identifies a series of fundamental rights, if you like, obligations for victims of crime, and shows how police can be first in aid, services can help victims to cope and recover, reparation can restore, victims can be heard. Victims can be heard, as you've heard, they're not always well heard in our parole system even. A comprehensive model and budget are put in the book that could be very influential on what I'm going to propose. The book also asserts that prevention of crime before it happens is as important as rights for victims. Indeed, today we have knowledge that we could reduce victimization in Canada, both property and violent crime, by 50% in the next few years. And this would be consistent with Canada's commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. My book on science and secrets of ending violent crime sets this out using proven strategies, sometimes from Canada even, and from other democracies. Every year, millions of Canadians are victims of crime, suffering losses, trauma, and a lot more. Cumulatively, these are estimated in tens of billions of tangible and intangible losses. Unfortunately, we continue more of the same, and so do not get different results. We allow violence and property crime because we fund short-term projects in pilot areas instead of sustained and adequate investments in smart prevention where it's most needed. The services and justice after the victimization exist some of the time in some of the provinces for some of the victims, but they're generally not adequate or consistent across Canada to meet enough of the needs. The current groups in the federal bureaucracy and the Bill of Rights are totally inadequate to what is needed. The units in the bureaucracy are too low, rarely have the skills needed, certainly don't have funds or mandate. In some, we need a prevention and victim justice services Canada and not just a corrections service Canada. So I'm going to propose that. I'm recommending that you look at developing legislation and funding federally so that victims of crime in Canada can have effective policies to prevent victimization and provide services and justice after the victimization. These must be consistent across Canada and comparable to what exists in other democracies. So I'm recommending a Crime Prevention and Victim Justice Act. It would establish an office for crime prevention and victim justice headed by a deputy minister and reporting to the Ministers of Justice and or Public Safety. Clearly, it has to work in collaboration with the provinces, territories, and Indigenous leaders. The federal government must provide this office annually with the equivalent of 10% of what it's currently spending on policing, courts, and corrections. Half of that funding going to prevention and half of that to improving services. The office would develop national standards, which we need, train officials and others, fund research and development, and ensure data collection is focused on results. What gets measured gets done. What gets measured gets done. It would also share costs so the provinces, territories, and Indigenous leaders can expand their own planning and implementation of effective prevention and services reparation and other components of victim justice. The Act would also legislate the role of the federal ombudsman, which would be strengthened and would report to Parliament with an annual budget similar to the correctional investigator. So I'm recommending that you go for it and actually make a difference to how victims are protected through prevention and how their basic rights are met through funding and legislation and leadership that comes from the federal government. Thank you.